Opening the English initiates a fight for central influence, often leading to flexible pawn structures and indirect pressure. Establishing central influence and opening lines for the queen and bishop immediately counterbalances white's flank opening. Initiating knight development, this central square control prepares for further pawn advances, creating early pawn tension. Developing the knight here adds pressure to the central pawn and prepares for a pawn push, aiming to control more of the board. Solidifying the kingside and preparing a fianchetto offers white a flexible pawn structure, anticipating potential central pawn breaks. Unleashing the f-pawn risks creating a permanent weakness on the kingside. Proceed with caution. Developing the bishop to g2 fianchetto prepares to control the long diagonal, potentially creating immense pressure on black's queenside, and preparing for kingside castling. Developing the knight to a natural square, this knight prepares to influence the central squares and potentially support a pawn advance or prepare for castling. Reinforcing the center while opening lines for the queen and bishop, this move gracefully sidesteps immediate confrontation, preferring quiet development. Developing the bishop to a very active diagonal, this piece the kingside while preparing for castling. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move subtly shores up the center, preparing for a more measured development where each piece can find its optimal square without immediate confrontation. Unleashing a pawn storm with that pawn suddenly opens up the f-file, a double-edged sword that demands immediate attention, potentially exposing your king if not handled with utmost precision and foresight. Opening the f-file this way forcefully clarifies the central situation, potentially exposing weaknesses for both sides, but offering white a chance to develop an attacking presence. Black decisively brings the king to safety, a crucial step after opening lines with f5 and f4, while white's pawn structure remains somewhat fragmented, potentially creating targets for black's pieces later. Developing the knight to a more central square, it prepares to leap into the fight on the kingside, potentially supporting a pawn push or reinforcing other pieces as the position opens up, while also safeguarding the castled king's retreat route. Aims to connect the rooks by clearing the e-file, potentially redeploying the queen to a more active square like g6 or h5 while supporting a future d5 push, though it might expose the king somewhat if white can open lines quickly. Securing the monarch's safety behind a castled structure offers crucial defensive stability. Black solidifies the center, aiming to support the d5 square and potentially prepare a future advance with d5. This move also subtly opens a diagonal for the queen should it reroute. Reclaiming central squares is the priority here, as the knight's sortie to the edge aims to disrupt black's bishop and potentially open lines. This maneuver, though seemingly distant, forces a strategic calculation about who will ultimately control the crucial d5 and e4 squares. The bishop surges forward, contesting the central diagonal and posing a direct threat to the white king's sanctuary. This aggressive positioning aims to disrupt white's intended kingside expansion and might set up interesting tactical possibilities or force a positional concession from the opponent. Disrupting the dark square presence, white exchanges the knight, opening the d-file for potential future piece activity while simultaneously eliminating a key defender of black's king. Black's recapture on d4 solidifies control over the center and opens the e-file for potential future pressure, a welcome development after a slightly passive opening. Attempting to curb black's burgeoning queenside influence and prevent any sneaky knight maneuvers towards the kingside, white shores up the kingside pawn structure, though at the cost of some long-term flexibility and potentially opening a weakness on the g3 square if black can eventually target it. Seeking to destabilize white's kingside pawn structure, black pushes the h-pawn, aiming to create a dynamic imbalance and potentially open lines towards the white monarch. Attempting to shore up the queenside and prevent black's potential pawn storm initiation on the b-file, this move nonetheless creates a slight weakness on the b3 square and does little to address the central pawn structure or the lingering pressure on white's kingside. While the ambition is clear to create counterplay and potentially open lines for the rooks, it feels like a defensive reaction rather than a proactive step, possibly allowing black to consolidate and continue their development with greater ease. The king remains a target. Black's pawn advance on the queen side intends to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create an open file for counterplay, though it also slightly weakens the queen side's pawn shield. Securing the c4 square from immediate knightly intrusion while attempting to launch a counteroffensive on the queen side, this maneuver subtly redirects white's attention, aiming to exploit the potentially exposed c6 pawn and create queenside space. The queen embarks on an intriguing journey, aiming to exploit the open diagonal leading towards white's kingside, a bold maneuver that could destabilize the pawn structure if white isn't vigilant. Shifting the knight to b2 isn't about immediate tactical fireworks. It's a deep positional maneuver, rerouting the knight to potentially reinforce c4 or even aim for a d3 square maneuver. This subtle repositioning aims to create a more robust pawn structure, especially if black's aggressive pawn advances on the kingside leave their own king exposed to future pressure. It also frees up the a-pawn for a potential queenside expansion later, a common theme in many flank openings. Unleashing the bishop to f5 creates a fascinating dynamic, immediately challenging the pawn structure on the kingside and potentially opening lines towards white's castled monarch. This bishop's repositioning might disrupt white's defensive setup, hinting at a future pawn storm or piece infiltration aimed at the weakened light squares. It's a proactive response, seeking to capitalize on any lingering imprecision in white's earlier development, particularly the placement of the knight on b2. Observe how this bishop now eyes the d3 square, a critical point that could become a target if white isn't careful. This move injects tactical possibilities and forces white to seriously consider their next defensive measures or risk falling behind in development. Unleashing the queen to actively target the kingside shadows and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure, this maneuver also prepares for future pawn pushes or piece repositioning, seeking to exploit the now weakened dark squares around black's king after its f-pawn advance. Unleashing the knight to d7 injects a latent threat of central infiltration, aiming to bypass white's king's pawn shield and exploit the e3 square, a potential landing zone for a daring knight sortie. Opening the central file for your rook signals an immediate intent to challenge black's control and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside, even as white's own king remains somewhat exposed. The knight boldly ventures to the outpost, aiming to disrupt white's queenside stability and eye weaknesses. The bishop's retreat to f1 unlocks the rook's potential on e1, creating a flexible battery and preparing for a potential kingside push, while also defending the light squares around white's own monarch. Preparing to liberate that rook from its passive posting on the file, aiming for a more active role on the kingside, where the opposing monarch's safety is becoming increasingly questionable. Initiating a regrouping of white's pieces, the bishop repositions to a square that offers improved defensive coverage for the kingside and eyes the long diagonal, aiming to challenge black's aggressively placed queen and potentially support a future pawn advance on the queen side. The rook, having completed its journey across the board, now settles onto the b6 square, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially activate itself on the open b-file should it materialize. This position, with black's queenside pawns pushed forward, hints at a desire for active counterplay, even at the cost of creating some structural weaknesses. The king's safety remains paramount. Exploiting a temporarily exposed piece, this capture immediately injects significant material imbalance and forces black to confront a severe organizational crisis. A bold gamble by black, sacrificing material to disrupt white's queenside structure and open lines towards the king. This aggressive pawn push aims to create chaos and exploit any immediate weaknesses, prioritizing dynamic play over static material advantage. Re-establishing a diagonal outpost on the light squares aims to disrupt black's developing initiative, though it risks isolating the bishop if black can adequately defend the squares it now influences. Reclaiming initiative and preparing to challenge white's bishop on b2, this maneuver aims to dislodge the centralized knight and open diagonals for the queen, potentially leading to a swift counterplay down the file. Attempting to open a new avenue for the queenside rook, but this pawn push feels more like a distraction than a decisive blow, potentially overextending white's pawns without adequately supporting them. Black's rook now occupies a commanding position on the 6th rank, directly challenging the advanced white pawn and creating a dangerous battery with the bishop on d4. White seizes the last available file with the pawn, intending to initiate a queenside pawn storm and deny black any breathing room on that flank. The doubled pawns on the file, while creating a structure that could be a weakness later, serve an immediate purpose of expansion. The king's flight to the h-file offers a much-needed escape route from the looming pressure on the queen side and aims to consolidate the defensive structure, creating a haven from white's probing knight. Refocusing the battery of rooks onto the central files aims to exploit the structural weaknesses created by black's pawn thrusts, potentially opening avenues for the queen and knight to become more active in the coming skirmishes. Grasping for pawn leverage, black ventures b6, a daring gamble to pry open the queenside and establish a foothold on the b3 square. This maneuver injects immediate tactical tension, aiming to disrupt white's intended queenside expansion. However, it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure on that flank, potentially creating targets for white's later attack. The decision hinges on black's ability to generate sufficient counterplay before white consolidates and exploits the exposed dark squares. The bishop's redeployment to e1 aims to reroute it towards the queenside, potentially reinforcing the a5 pawn or preparing for future exchanges that might favor white's slightly more active pieces. The pawn grab on a5 initiates a complex positional struggle, sacrificing material for active piece play and the hope of disrupting white's pawn structure. Black's intention here is to pry open the queenside, forcing white's pieces into awkward defensive postures. While it looks tempting to win a pawn, this maneuver leaves black's king with fewer defenders and potentially creates weaknesses that white can exploit if black doesn't find concrete compensation. The initiative black gains needs to be converted before white can consolidate their now exposed king. The knight's journey to the queenside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and target weaknesses, a bold maneuver after white's initial queenside pawn push. The rook on d3 injects chaos, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines towards the king, but it boldly ventures deep into enemy territory, making its long-term survival a significant question mark. Snapping off the pinned knight with your bishop resolves the immediate tactical threat, freeing your position and allowing your rooks to potentially activate on the d-file. Suddenly, the previously locked queenside is blasted open, creating an unusual central pawn majority for black and a very exposed white king. A bold recapture, aiming to dislodge black's persistent bishop and inject some life into white's languishing queenside, though it opens a precarious diagonal towards white's own king should black find the right follow-up. Reclaiming the central squares with this knight hop dramatically alters the positional landscape, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated piece activity and potentially open lines for a more active rook on the d-file. The queen now aims to exploit the open diagonal towards the black king, creating a potential battery with the bishop should the d-file open further, and simultaneously adding pressure to the queenside. Seizing the initiative, the knight surges forward, aiming to disrupt white's entire pawn structure and force concessions, especially with that vulnerable a pawn now exposed to repeated attacks. Unlocking tactical possibilities, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's advanced knight and potentially create new pathways for white's own pieces. Black gambits away the knight, sacrificing material for an active rook on the open file and hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure. Liberating the rook from its compromised position on the file, this capture aims to untangle white's pieces and initiate a more harmonious development, albeit at the cost of material. The immediate consequence is an attempt to exploit black's somewhat passive pawn structure and perhaps create counterplay on the now open c-file, forcing a reckoning with the isolated pawn on d4 and the potentially vulnerable king nestled behind a weakened pawn shield. The knight's audacious leap to the queenside seems like a desperate gambit, but it aims to disrupt white's rook on the newly acquired open file and potentially create counterplay by targeting vulnerable pawns. The rook's repositioning to the 4th rank suddenly creates a potent attacking spearhead, threatening to pierce black's weakened defenses around the king. The knight's desperate gambit has paid off, but now the queen embarks on a solo mission, seeking tactical disruption in white's ranks. Unleashing the bishop to pin the knight along the long diagonal creates immediate pressure, potentially opening lines toward black's king and demanding a precise response to avoid significant material loss or positional unraveling. The knight's repositioning aims to unpin the rook and potentially activate the queen, creating a double attack on the pawn, a clever attempt to exploit the scattered white pieces, though it invites further material imbalances as white now has an open file for their own rook. The rook's triumphant sweep across the 7th rank finally claims the sacrificed knight, consolidating white's material advantage and setting up a promising endgame scenario where controlling open files will be paramount. Seeking a final flourish, the black queen sacrifices itself with a check, initiating a dramatic endgame where material is dramatically imbalanced, potentially forcing a swift resolution. The king, now exposed on the open diagonal, becomes a primary target for any lurking threats, demanding immediate attention to its safety before any further piece exchanges. Capturing the rook, black aims to solidify their material advantage and simplify into a winning endgame, though white still has a passed pawn on the file to consider. Recapturing the pawn with the queen opens up lines, but with your king still on its starting square and no clear defensive structure, this feels like a daring gambit, trading material for tempo that might not be fully realized.